The year was 742, a continent without unity, without memory, and without hope of empire. The mighty Rome that had once ruled from the Atlantic to the Euphrates had vanished, leaving behind only ruins and whispers. In its place, warlords squabbled over broken lands. The Franks, Saxons, Lombards, and countless tribes carved their destinies in iron and blood. Faith wavered, knowledge faded, and power belonged to whoever could seize it. It was not yet Europe. It was only chaos. Amid this uncertainty, a child was born, a boy named Charles, son of Pepin the Short, king of the Franks. His mother, Bertrada of Leon, was said to have dreamed of a tree that rose from her womb and cast its shadow over all Europe. In time, people would look back and say that the dream had been prophecy. For this boy would become Charlemagne Charles the Great, the man who would bind together a fractured world. Charles's childhood was steeped in contrasts, the silence of cloisters and the clangor of the forge. He studied Latin from monks who still guarded the crumbling wisdom of Rome, yet his true lessons came from the saddle. The Franks were born to war, baptized in rivers of blood and faith. From an early age, Charles learned that to rule men, one must command both their swords and their souls. When his father Pepin died in 768, the realm was divided between Charles and his younger brother, Carloman. For a brief moment, two kings ruled one people. But the kingdom itself was a creature of restlessness, always shifting, always hungry. Charles was bold, impulsive, driven by destiny. Carloman was cautious, reserved, and distrustful. Between them stood their mother, pleading for peace. Yet beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Every victory Charles won seemed a slight to his brother. Every hesitation from Carloman felt like betrayal. Then fate intervened. In 771, Carloman died, suddenly, perhaps of illness, perhaps not. Some whispered that the hand of destiny had guided the moment. Others whispered darker things. Whatever the truth, Charles moved swiftly. He seized his brother's lands, unified the kingdom, and proclaimed himself sole king of the Franks. There was no rebellion, no civil war, only the silence of inevitability. That silence would not last. To the east, the Saxons defied both cross and crown. To the south, the Lombards pressed against Rome. Beyond the Pyrenees, the Emirates of Al-Andalus waited in their golden cities. The world was vast and divided, but Charles's ambition was larger still. He believed that God himself had chosen him to restore the order that had once been lost, to bring light where barbarism had swallowed civilization. He built his armies not as raiders, but as instruments of divine purpose. His war banners carried the cross. His campaigns baptized whole nations. Where others saw conquest, he saw creation. To rule, he would one day say, is to serve the will of heaven. In his vision, the Franks were not merely a tribe, they were the vessel through which God would rebuild the world. And so the legend began. In the young king's march across rivers and mountains, the spirit of Rome flickered back to life. The dream of unity, once shattered by centuries of darkness, had found its architect. His sword would shape borders, his faith would shape destiny, and from the chaos of a dying world, Europe would be born. The kingdom Charles inherited was vast, but fragile, a patchwork of loyalties, stitched together by fear and faith. The Franks were strong, yet their unity was recent, their nobles ambitious, and their neighbours restless. The death of Carloman had brought peace on the surface, but beneath it, Europe watched and waited to see whether this new king could truly hold what he had seized. Charles was only 29, but already his presence filled every hall. Tall, broad-chested, with commanding eyes that could melt into warmth or steel in a breath, he had the charisma of a born ruler. He spoke Latin with monks, strategy with generals, and faith with priests. Yet behind his measured tone was a mind that calculated every alliance, every word, every marriage. He needed stability and quickly. His first move was diplomatic brilliance cloaked in audacity. To the south, the Lombards threatened the Pope, besieging cities in Italy and daring to defy Rome itself. Charles offered help to the Church, knowing that divine approval was the only crown that never tarnished. In return, Pope Hadrian I blessed him as defender of the faith. But Charles's alliance came with risk. He was already married to Desiderata, the daughter of the Lombard king. That union had been meant to secure peace, but now it was a chain linking him to his enemies. In a move that stunned every court in Europe, Charles repudiated his Lombard wife after only a year, sending her back to her father's court. It was an act both political and personal, a declaration that no king, no alliance would dictate his destiny. War followed swiftly. In 773, the Frankish armies crossed the Alps, an echo of Hannibal, but in reverse. Snow blinded men, frost shattered hooves, yet Charles pressed on. His army, an iron river of faith and fury, descended into Italy. At Pavia, the Lombard capital, the siege lasted months. When the gates finally fell, Charles entered the city not as a destroyer, but as a restorer. He took the Iron Crown of Lombardy and placed it upon his head. The Franks were no longer just kings, they were kings of the Franks and Lombards, rulers of lands from the Pyrenees to the Adriatic. Yet his victory was not only on the battlefield. Charles understood the power of symbolism. He restored lands to the Pope, fortified monasteries, and presented himself as the sword of Christendom, the man who would defend faith, order, and Rome itself. He was shaping not just territory, but identity. Europe was beginning to imagine itself again, not as scattered tribes, but as one faith, one civilization, under one protector. But peace was never more than an interlude in his story. No sooner had Italy been subdued than word arrived from the north. The Saxons had risen again. They had burned churches, slaughtered priests, and defied baptism. Their leader, Widukind, preached rebellion against the Roman god. It was not merely a revolt, it was a holy war. Charles, who saw himself as God's instrument, could not ignore it. The Lombard campaign had made him a king of two crowns. The Saxon Wars would make him something greater or destroy him entirely. In his court at Aachen, the fires of strategy burned late into the night. Maps were spread, envoys dispatched, armies summoned. The king's gaze fell north, where the forests of Saxony waited dark, unbroken, and unconverted. He rose, lifted his sword, and spoke quietly to his captains. If they will not kneel before the cross, then Europe will never stand. Thus began a war that would last 30 years, a crusade before the word existed. The forests of Saxony were unlike any other battlefield in Europe, endless, dark, and alive with the defiance of a people who refused to bow. The Saxons worshipped their own gods, Woden, Donar, the spirits of stone and grove. To them, the Franks were invaders. To Charles, they were souls trapped in pagan night. Between the Rhine and the Elbe, faith met fury, and the wars that followed would define his reign. In 772, Charlemagne marched north. His banners carried the sign of the cross, and his army, an iron tide of horsemen, spearmen, and priests, moved with holy precision. Their target was the Irminsul, a massive oak pillar that the Saxons believed held up the sky itself. To destroy it was to break the spine of their faith. When the Franks reached it, they surrounded the sacred grove. The priests of Woden screamed, the drums thundered, but the Frankish axes fell. The great pillar crashed to the ground, flames devouring its roots. That night, Charles watched from his camp as the fire rose into the sky. He believed he had struck a blow not just for conquest, but for eternity. Yet the Saxons would not yield. For every village baptized, another revolted. They burned churches, ambushed patrols, and slaughtered converts. The war dragged on not months, but decades, a relentless cycle of rebellion and reprisal. The line between conversion and massacre blurred until even the chroniclers wrote of iron baptized in blood. Charlemagne's faith was as unshakable as his will. He saw himself as God's hammer, chosen to forge civilization from chaos. His wars were sermons, his victories, scripture. He built monasteries beside fortresses, sent missionaries behind his armies, and carried both sword and psalter. To his followers, he was the defender of Christendom. To his enemies, he was the beast of revelation. In 777, he called a great assembly at Paderborn, summoning lords, bishops, and newly converted Saxons. There, he proclaimed that all who accepted baptism would be treated as brothers. Many came forward, weary of war, but not Widukind, the shadow king of Saxony. He vanished into the forests, gathering warriors who would not kneel. His rebellion would ignite again and again, each time fiercer than before. The conflict reached its darkest moment in 782. After a Saxon ambush near the river Elbe killed thousands of Frankish soldiers, Charlemagne's fury consumed him. At Verdun, he ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon captives, men accused of rejecting baptism and rising against the crown. The river ran red for days. The act shocked even his allies. Some said the king had crossed from divine justice into divine wrath. But to Charles, mercy was a luxury the future could not afford. After Verdun, resistance faltered. The Saxons, crushed and baptized by force, began to fade into his empire. Monasteries rose where sacred groves had stood. Roads, churches, and laws bound the north to his will. It was a victory of both sword and scripture, and it changed Europe forever. When at last Widukind surrendered in 785, Charles himself stood as godfather at his baptism. The old warrior was robed in white, his hair shorn, his fate sealed. The king who had once burned his forests now poured holy water over his head. The iron and the cross had become one. But peace in Saxony did not bring rest. The fires of ambition burned too fiercely. To the south, Italy still needed order. To the west, the Muslims of Spain beckoned with both danger and opportunity. And to the east, rumours whispered of new kingdoms rising beyond the Danube. The king who had conquered faith now sought to conquer destiny. The war was over at least, that was what the chronicles said. Yet beneath the ashes of the Saxon forests, rebellion still smouldered. Charlemagne had won the land, but not the hearts of its people. The Franks built churches on scorched ground. Monks sang Latin hymns where the smoke of sacrifice once curled to pagan gods. But in every village, in every hollow tree, the Saxons whispered of Widukind, the warrior who had once defied a king and made even Rome tremble. For Charles, victory demanded more than conquest. It required transformation. The Saxons would not remain enemies. They would become Christians, or they would vanish from history. He ordered mass baptisms by the rivers, where thousands knelt in trembling lines. Some came willingly, weary from endless war. Others came in chains. Cold water poured over them, and priests murmured Latin words they barely understood. It was faith by fire, salvation by command. The king called this peace, but it was a peace built on discipline. He imposed a new code of laws. Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae. It decreed that any man who refused baptism would be put to death. Anyone who attacked a priest or desecrated a church would hang. Even those who fasted during Lent without cause could lose their lives. To the modern ear, it sounds like tyranny. To Charlemagne, it was purification. In his mind, faith and order were the same, and disobedience was rebellion against both God and king. Still, not all bowed quietly. In the northern forests, small bands of warriors swore oaths to the old gods in secret, carving runes into trees, hiding relics of their past beneath church altars. Charlemagne's spies hunted them. His soldiers burned their homes, and yet the resistance lingered. The Saxons had been broken militarily, but culturally they fought on until 785, when Widukind himself returned. The rebel leader came not with an army, but with surrender. He appeared before Charles at Attigny, cloaked in humility. The two men stood face to face, the emperor-to-be and the ghost of rebellion. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then Widukind knelt. Charlemagne lifted the basin, poured water over his head, and gave him a new name, Christianus. The chroniclers wrote that the Saxon lord wept as the water touched his hair. Some said it was repentance, others said it was the last defiance, tears for the gods he had buried. From that moment, Widukind disappeared from history. Some claimed he lived quietly under Frankish rule. Others whispered that he became a monk. A few legends say he died a martyr, secretly faithful to his ancestors. Whatever the truth, his submission marked the final chapter of the Saxon Wars. For Charles, it was a triumph unlike any before. He had forged not just a kingdom, but a Christian civilization, stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe. The church called him Rex Pius, the pious king. The people called him Carolus Magnus. But peace could never hold long in the hands of such a man. His gaze turned south again, toward Italy, where his Lombard crown gleamed and the shadow of the Papacy loomed. He had become God's hammer in the north. Now he would become the shield of Rome. What began as conquest had become a crusade. What began as faith had become empire. The man who tamed the Saxons would now challenge kings, priests, and emperors alike, and in doing so, step into a destiny no ruler before him had dared to claim. By the time the Saxon forests fell silent, Charlemagne's name carried across every corner of Europe. To his people, he was a ruler blessed by God. To his enemies, a storm wearing a crown. Yet his ambition reached beyond victory, it sought permanence. He had conquered the pagan north. Now he turned his gaze southward, toward the old lands of empire. Italy, fractured and feuding, had long been the heart of faith and the grave of kings. The Lombards, a fierce people from the north, had carved their own kingdom there. But their power had grown dangerous, especially to the Pope, who ruled not through armies, but through an idea that spiritual authority stood above every crown. The Lombard king, Desiderius, dared to defy that authority. He marched on Rome, seized papal lands, and threatened the sanctity of St. Peter itself. The Pope, Hadrian I, sent a desperate plea for help not to Byzantium, not to any Italian prince, but to the Frankish king beyond the Alps, the same man who had once been Desiderius's son-in-law. Charlemagne answered, he saw more than an ally to protect. He saw destiny unfolding. To defend the Pope was to defend the Church. To defend the Church was to inherit its blessing. In 773, he gathered his armies once again, long columns of cavalry and infantry, priests bearing relics at their head, iron banners gleaming beneath the snow. The Alps loomed before them like walls of stone. The passes were treacherous, the cold, lethal, but Charles pressed forward, invoking the name of God with every step. On the far side of the mountains, the Lombard fortresses fell one by one. The great city of Pavia resisted, holding out through winter. Within its walls, King Desiderius waited, defiant but doomed. The siege dragged for months. Famine crept in, disease spread. Even the Lombard nobles began to whisper prayers for mercy. Finally, in the spring of 774, the gates opened. The Franks entered in solemn silence. Desiderius was led before Charlemagne, broken, defeated, his crown trembling in his hands. The Frankish king took it, not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. He knelt in the Basilica of St. Ambrose and was anointed king of the Lombards. It was the first time one man wore both crowns, the iron circlet of Italy and the golden diadem of the Franks. In Rome, the Pope received him as a deliverer. Together, they entered St. Peter's Basilica, where the incense rose like mist and the bells thundered across the city. Hadrian greeted him not as an equal, but as a protector, Patricius Romanorum, guardian of Rome. From that moment, the alliance between throne and altar was sealed in sanctity and steel. Yet, Charlemagne's victory was not only spiritual. The conquest of Lombardy gave him control of trade routes, fortresses, and the fertile plains of the Po Valley. It connected his northern heartlands to the Mediterranean, reviving the pulse of empire through roads that had once belonged to Caesar. But within this triumph lay a question the world had not yet asked. If a king could protect Rome, could he not also rule it? If the Pope crowned kings, who then crowned the Pope? Charlemagne left Italy triumphant but thoughtful. His empire now stretched farther than any since antiquity. Yet he sensed that war and faith alone could not hold it together. To endure, a kingdom needed order, law, and knowledge, the light of civilization itself. And so, while his soldiers rested, the king began a quieter conquest, not of lands, but of minds. The sword had built his empire. Now he would seek to give it a soul. Rome had seen 1,000 crowns before him, Caesars, usurpers, emperors whose statues now lay broken among weeds. Yet on the morning of Christmas Day, 800 A.D., as sunlight pierced the high windows of St. Peter's Basilica, a new kind of ruler walked its marble floor. Not a Roman born, not an emperor by inheritance, but a barbarian from the forests of the north, the man they called Charles the Great. For nearly 3 decades, Charlemagne had fought, built, and ruled with a singular purpose: to restore what had been lost: unity, faith, and order. The world he inherited was fractured. The world he now ruled was awakening. From the Atlantic to the Danube, from the North Sea to the Apennines, his empire spanned the heart of Europe. Roads bustled with merchants again. Monasteries thrived. Law replaced chaos. He had forged not merely a kingdom, but a civilization, and now Rome would give it a name. The city was alive with expectation. Pilgrims filled the streets. Soldiers lined the basilica. The air smelled of incense and pine. Inside, the choir sang Gloria in Excelsis Deo as Charlemagne knelt before the altar, his great frame wrapped in a simple linen robe. He had come to pray, not to be crowned, or so the chronicles claim. But history often hides its turning points in humility. Behind him stood Pope Leo III, the man whose life Charlemagne had once saved from Roman conspirators. As the king bowed his head in prayer, Leo lifted a golden crown from the altar. The music swelled, and before the gathered bishops and nobles of Christendom, the Pope placed it upon Charles's brow, proclaiming in Latin, "Carolus Augustus, Emperor of the Romans." The crowd erupted in thunderous acclamation. Bells rang, trumpets sounded, and the Empire of the West, long dead since the fall of Rome, was reborn. Charlemagne's face, witnesses said, did not show triumph. Some claimed he was stunned, even angered, that the Pope had acted without his consent. Others believed it was all planned, a divine theatre staged for eternity. Whatever the truth, that morning in Rome bound together two powers that would define Europe for 1,000 years: the Church and the Empire. He was now Emperor of the Romans, yet no Caesar had ever worn such a crown. His empire was not built on marble, but on faith. Its borders were not defended by legions, but by conviction. Where Rome had ruled by might, Charlemagne sought to rule by purpose. He dreamed of an empire not only united by law, but enlightened by learning a Christian Rome reborn in the north. When he returned to his capital at Aachen, he began to build what he called the New Rome. There were no pagan temples here, only halls of knowledge. Scholars, scribes, and philosophers came from across Europe, from Ireland, Italy, Saxony, and Spain, to teach, translate, and preserve the wisdom of the ancients. At the centre of it all stood Charlemagne himself, now grey-bearded, massive, still vigorous, often seen discussing scripture 1 hour and military logistics the next. He had become something no one in Europe had seen since antiquity, a ruler of the mind and the sword, the law and the spirit. The coronation in Rome had given him divine legitimacy, but in Aachen he sought something greater still. He wanted to build not just an empire of Christians. He wanted to build Christendom itself. And so began his most ambitious campaign, a war not fought with steel, but with ink and parchment, with faith and learning. The sword had forged Europe's body, now he would forge its soul. When Charlemagne returned from Rome, he carried not only a crown, but a burden to prove that his empire was more than conquest. A ruler could crush nations, but to build one required something rarer: wisdom. He had seen enough of war. Now he would fight a different battle against ignorance itself. His chosen weapon was knowledge, and his capital, Aachen, would become the beating heart of a new age. At its centre rose the Palatine Chapel, an octagonal marvel of stone and light, part church, part throne room, part symbol. Its arches echoed both Roman grandeur and Christian devotion. Here, Charlemagne prayed, governed, and dreamed. The air was filled with the smell of parchment and beeswax, the murmur of scribes at work, the rhythm of learning reborn. Europe had forgotten how to read. Latin had fractured into dialects. Books were few and precious. Even priests stumbled through scripture they barely understood. Charlemagne saw it as a sickness, a slow death of the mind. "Let no man serve at the altar," he declared, "who cannot read the word of God." And so, from across his empire, he summoned men of letters. Foremost among them was Alcuin of York, a scholar from the distant north of England, gentle in speech, sharp in intellect, and utterly devoted to learning. Charlemagne met him not as a king meets a subject, but as a student meets a teacher. Together, they devised a plan to educate the empire. Monasteries became schools, cathedrals became academies. Children of nobles and commoners alike were taught to read, write, and think. From Alcuin's hand came a revolution that would shape history. The development of the Carolingian script, clear, elegant, and uniform, the ancestor of modern handwriting. Through it, Europe rediscovered the clarity of communication. Ancient texts, Aristotle, Augustine, Virgil, and more, were copied, preserved, and spread across the continent. What might have perished in the shadows of time was saved by the ink of monks and the will of a king. Yet Charlemagne's court was no monastery of silence. It was alive with debate. Philosophers argued theology beside generals. Poets recited verses, while diplomats discussed borders. The emperor himself delighted in discourse. He was no scholar in the strict sense. His Latin was imperfect, his writing clumsy, but his hunger for understanding was relentless. He asked questions few kings ever dared. What is justice? What is truth? What makes a man good? He once told Alcuin, to rule a people, one must first rule oneself. That phrase, simple yet profound, became the silent motto of his reign. Under his guidance, Europe began to see itself not merely as a land of warriors, but as a community of believers and thinkers, a Christian civilization. But this Renaissance was not born without tension. Some nobles mocked his obsession with learning. Others feared that knowledge would weaken obedience. Even the church grew wary, uneasy that the emperor's intellect might rival its own authority. Yet Charlemagne pressed on, convinced that faith without understanding was blind. In the evenings, when the court grew quiet, he would walk alone beneath the arches of his chapel, listening to the wind against the stained glass. He often paused before a bronze equestrian statue, a relic from ancient Rome, and studied its form. To many, it was merely decoration. To him, it was a question. Could a new Rome be built not of conquest, but of wisdom? The answer, he believed, was yes. By the twilight of his reign, scribes were copying books faster than wars could burn them. The written word once again flowed through Europe's veins. What the sword could not unify, knowledge did. The age of Charlemagne had become more than an empire. It had become an idea that even in darkness, civilization could be reborn. By the dawn of the 9th century, Charlemagne's empire stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to the borders of Byzantium, a realm so vast it could not be crossed in a single lifetime. No ruler since Caesar had commanded such dominion, yet his kingdom was no Rome of marble. It was a patchwork of tribes, tongues, and tempers, Franks, Saxons, Lombards, Bavarians, Burgundians, Aquitanians, all bound by one crown and one faith. To govern them, Charlemagne had to be more than a conqueror. He had to be an architect of order. From his palace at Aachen, the emperor ruled not by whim, but by rhythm, councils, edicts, and inspection. He divided his empire into regions governed by counts and dukes, men loyal to him but watched closely. To ensure their honesty, he created a new institution, the Missi Dominici, the envoys of the Lord. These royal agents travelled in pairs, one noble, one churchman, carrying sealed orders from the emperor. They rode from province to province, investigating corruption, enforcing law, and reporting directly back to Aachen. It was a system centuries ahead of its time, the nervous system of a living empire. Law, to Charlemagne, was divine architecture. He reformed old customs, blending Roman discipline with Frankish tradition. His decrees, the capitularies, reached into every corner of life. Justice, trade, marriage, even the cleanliness of streets. Some were harsh, others merciful, but all shared one aim to bind 100 peoples under one rule of order. Without law, he said, faith itself falls into chaos. But ruling through faith was a double-edged sword. The church had been his greatest ally, yet also his greatest challenge. Bishops wielded immense influence. Monasteries grew wealthy and independent. Charlemagne needed their cooperation, but never surrendered his sovereignty. He called councils, disciplined wayward clergy, and demanded that priests live as examples of purity, not privilege. The Pope was God's servant on earth, yes, but in Charlemagne's vision, the emperor was God's executor. He saw himself not as the ruler of a people, but as the shepherd of Christendom, Imperator Christianorum. And yet, beneath this sacred vision, cracks began to show. The empire was too vast, its languages too many, its customs too deep to erase. Even the loyalty of his sons could not be guaranteed. He had fathered many children, legitimate and not, but it was his sons by Queen Hildegard who carried his hopes: Charles the Younger, Pepin of Italy, and Louis of Aquitaine. He divided the empire among them, hoping unity would grow from harmony. But history rarely honours such hopes. Brothers who inherit a giant rarely agree how to bear its weight. Still, in his later years, Charlemagne's reign seemed a miracle of balance. Markets flourished, borders held, justice was dispensed with speed and precision. Travellers marvelled at the roads that linked towns, the churches that crowned every hill, the schools that taught children who had never seen war. To the world beyond his borders, he was a colossus, the defender of faith, the embodiment of Christian kingship. Yet even colossi cast long shadows. Beyond the Rhine, the old Saxon forests still whispered resentment. Across the Pyrenees, the Saracens waited, patient as the desert. And within the emperor's own family, ambition stirred quietly. In the winter evenings, Charlemagne sat by the fire in Aachen, surrounded by maps and manuscripts. His hands trembled now, his beard white as frost. He spoke little, but those close to him recalled one phrase repeated often: "I have built an empire of men, but can it survive without the heart of one?" He knew what many rulers never admit, that power dies with the hand that wields it, but ideas, if sown deeply enough, may endure. And so, as his empire glittered at its height, the seeds of its decline were already being planted. In the twilight of his reign, the great emperor's victories lay behind him like fading banners. The sword that had carved Europe was sheathed. The hand that once commanded nations had grown unsteady. Yet Charlemagne's mind remained sharp, restless, haunted not by enemies abroad but by uncertainty within. For every empire is strongest just before it begins to break. The cracks began not in war, but in blood his own. His sons, once the pillars of succession, had begun to drift into rivalry. He had divided his empire among them, hoping wisdom would bind what inheritance might divide. But Charles the Younger grew impatient. Pepin of Italy hungered for independence. And Louis of Aquitaine, the quiet, thoughtful one, seemed more monk than monarch. The old emperor watched them from his council hall, his gaze heavy with disappointment. He had built an empire that stretched across a continent, yet could not ensure peace within his own family. Then fate intervened, as it had so often in his life. One by one, his sons died before him. Pepin in 810, Charles the Younger in 811. By 813, only Louis remained. The emperor summoned him to Aachen, a solemn, silent meeting between the father who had conquered the world and the son who would inherit its burdens. In the great chapel, before an assembly of nobles and clergy, Charlemagne rose slowly from his throne. His robes of purple and gold shimmered in the candlelight. He placed a simple crown upon Louis's head, not with grandeur, but with weary grace. No trumpets, no declaration, only the words, "Be worthy of what has been given." Then he embraced his son and stepped back into the shadows. His duty done. But even as succession was secured, the emperor's heart grew heavy. He had seen his empire bloom, cities rebuilt, learning revived, faith renewed, yet he knew how fragile it all was. Reports reached Aachen of distant provinces rebelling, of nobles growing arrogant, of clerics feasting more than fasting. The unity he had forged through force and vision was fraying at the edges. His health declined through the winter of 813. Fevers came and went, his breath grew shallow, yet he continued to govern, dictating laws, overseeing schools, and attending mass daily. Chroniclers wrote that he spent his last days walking the corridors of his palace, stopping often before the bronze statue of a Roman emperor he had brought from Ravenna. Some say he spoke to it as to a mirror, a silent conversation between past and present. between the Rome that was and the Rome he had tried to resurrect. He confessed to his priest that he feared not death, but decay, not the end of his life, but the unravelling of his work. "I built on faith," he said softly, "but faith must live in men's hearts, not in their fear of kings." The final winter was harsh. Snow covered Aachen in a shroud of silence. Inside the palace, torches burned low. On January 28, 814, as dawn touched the chapel windows, Charlemagne the man who had built Europe took his last breath. He was 72. They laid him to rest not in a grand sarcophagus, but seated upright upon a marble throne, dressed in imperial robes, a crown upon his head and a sword in his hands. Around his neck hung a golden cross. On his knees rested a copy of the Gospels. It was not merely a burial, it was a declaration. The warrior, the scholar, the king, and the servant of God had become one. As the bells of Aachen tolled across the empire, men and women wept openly in the streets. Monks sang requiems. Soldiers knelt in silence. Even those who had once feared him spoke his name with reverence. For in his death, the idea of Europe, that fragile dream of unity, law, and faith, did not die. It lingered, waiting, whispering, through the centuries to come. Yet even as they mourned, the winds of division stirred. The empire he had forged by sword and spirit would soon fracture his legacy, tested his dream scattered. But legends do not end in the grave. They begin there. The bells of Aachen had long ceased ringing, but their echoes rolled across the centuries. The emperor was gone, yet his presence lingered like a shadow at dawn, vast and unyielding. Europe mourned, but more than that, it trembled. For Charlemagne had not merely ruled a land, he had defined it. And now the question no one dared speak aloud rose like mist from the Rhine. Could what he built survive without him? In the first years after his death, his son Louis the Pious ruled faithfully, humbly, almost timidly, the mirror opposite of his father. Where Charlemagne's voice had thundered across courts and cathedrals, Louis spoke softly, preferring prayers to decrees. Yet piety alone could not hold an empire born of iron. The lords grew restless, the borders strained, and the unity Charlemagne had hammered from chaos began to splinter. By mid-century, the empire was torn among his grandsons. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 divided it into three realms: France in the west, Germany in the east, and a fragile middle kingdom stretching from the North Sea to Italy. The dream of a single Europe faded into rivalry and war. The empire of Charlemagne, built through vision and blood, fractured within a generation. And yet something endured. The lands he united never forgot his name. His laws, copied and adapted, became the foundation of medieval governance. His schools birthed generations of clergy, scribes, and thinkers. His monasteries preserved the wisdom of Greece and Rome, saving civilization from the abyss. Even the coronation of later emperors from Otto the Great to Napoleon traced their lineage to that Christmas morning in 800, when a barbarian knelt in Rome and rose as Caesar reborn. In time, Charlemagne became less a man than a myth, the father of Europe, the holy emperor, the model of the Christian king. The church canonized his memory. Troubadours sang of his deeds. Kings invoked his name as a talisman of legitimacy. Yet beneath the legend was something profoundly human. A man who believed the world could be shaped by faith and order, by courage and conviction, by the fusion of sword and spirit. He had lived as if chosen by destiny, and perhaps he was, for while his empire fell, the idea he built did not. He had given Europe its first glimpse of itself, a continent bound not by race or tribe, but by belief in something higher, a moral order, a divine calling. Through centuries of division, that vision would burn quietly, rekindling in cathedrals, universities, and nations that all, in some way, bore his imprint. In Aachen, the emperor's tomb became a place of pilgrimage. Within its dim chapel, his throne remained a simple marble seat polished by time. Kings came to kneel before it, seeking the strength of the man who had ruled the known world, yet died with a cross on his chest and a prayer on his lips. His bones became relics, his memory a compass. And as the Middle Ages deepened, when darkness and war returned again and again, Europe would look back to that figure astride his horse, crowned and unshaken, carrying both sword and gospel. Charlemagne had not built an empire of stone, he had built an idea that empires could serve heaven, that power could preserve knowledge, that faith could forge civilization. And though the centuries shattered what he made, they could never erase what he began. He was the man who built Europe, and through every age that followed, Europe has never stopped trying to live up to his dream. He forged unity from chaos, faith from fire, and vision from violence. His empire has fallen, but his idea endures that courage guided by purpose can build a civilization, and conviction born of faith can outlast the centuries. He was not merely a king, he was a blueprint. This is the legacy of Charlemagne, the man who built Europe. If one man could rebuild a world from ashes, imagine what vision can build today. Subscribe for more stories that shape civilization. CHRONOS History-TV, where history breathes again.